Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Barnett. I'd like to welcome you to the BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and the latest developments in commodity markets. If you've been following our research lately, you'll have noticed we've got a number of notes out on the topic of commodities and inflation. And to kick off the conversation today, we're actually joined by our senior metals and mining analyst, Grant Sporre, who's also been writing about the important topic of commodity inflation. And so we're going to start with him because he's got to run to another meeting. But Grant, you've taken a look at both the, the steel market and the metals and mining space in the last few days. Tell us your sense. Where are we in the commodity cycle, and what's your sense of where we could be headed over the next 6 to 12 months?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the introduction. So, on the topic of particularly metals and inflation, I'd say if we look at the price performance of the metal complex, my view is that we're probably at a very mature phase of the recovery cycle. So we've got restocking behavior starting to cool. While demand remains firm, except for China, I would say, where it's looking to have cooled quite considerably. And we've also seen supply that's starting to normalize. There are some exceptions to that, and I'll get to those towards the end of my piece. But I guess it's at this mature point in the cycle where supply side shocks can actually make quite a strong performance differentiation. But all in all, the pricing signals that we're getting now should indicate that we're probably at the peak of the inflation cycle, certainly from a metals or a commodity input perspective, maybe not the energy complex, and I'll leave my colleagues to talk about that. But we have seen some of the commodities sort of hit their peak, such as copper, iron ore most certainly, and then European steel. So over the medium term, our view is that some of the metals, steel for example, could settle out at a higher, or let's call it a mid-cycle price than we've previously seen. And that's probably due to a combination of existing trade barriers, which I see continuing in some shape or form, good supply side management from the producers who are managing the supply back very cautiously, and of course the strains of decarbonisation, which is going to keep supply well in check. So more specifically, if I look at my European steel companies, they're probably on the right side of the inflation equation for now. So many of them will be negotiating contracts on an annual or quarterly basis at a higher level than they have had before, even though the spot market is just starting to soften or to roll over. And in the meantime, iron ore, which is one of their main cost inputs, has fallen very sharply by over $100 a ton. And that's mainly due to China's weakening demand and also their push to control pollution. So they're actively clamping down on any metal that produces a lot of pollution. But I'd say this is probably as good as it gets on a spot basis. So while the steel companies probably have a couple of quarters of positive earnings momentum, it's hard to see that being sustained well into 2022, especially with the weak auto sales that we're now seeing in Europe. And the auto sector is the second largest consumer of steel in Europe. I guess the flip side for all the consumers, and that's some of Rob's companies as well, but such as the auto producers and the industrials, they could see their costs rise as they still for the next couple of quarters as they absorb these contract rises. If I turn to the miners, look, they're probably likely to see margin contraction as the commodity feedback loop is now well and truly catching back up to them. So particularly things like steel, fuel, freight, and reagents are now starting to lead to some inflation for the miners specifically. The miners, for the most part, are talking about a regular inflationary spike, and they're not really seeing anything out of the ordinary. There's some labor inflation, particularly in Western Australia, but it's quite specific. They do have additional COVID costs, which they now sort of assume as business as usual. This is also particularly impacting projects where accommodation, as a simple example, can't be packed as densely as before. So COVID costs are going to contribute about 2 to 3%. The large miners with big global procurement divisions are talking about 5% increase in costs, in their cash costs. I must say our own calculations, if we do a breakdown, suggest it could be as high as 20%. Earlier on, I noted one exception, and that's aluminium. So the metal is still moving upwards and is hitting multi-decade highs. In part, this is due to China's so-called emissions control, but it's mostly an energy play. So it's the most energy-intensive metal to make. So if you want to think about it, it's effectively an oil, gas, and coal second derivative. So the tightness in the global energy markets is feeding through to aluminium, particularly thermal coal prices in China, and that's leading to quite a sharp cost push on the metal. So, and I thought that would be quite a good sort of point to hand it back to Rob and the team, given that they're going to talk about the energy markets.
Grant, before you leave us, one of the topics that we have had vigorous debate on this meeting about in the past is the energy transition, decarbonization, and I just want to get your sense of whether you think the metals and mining side of the equation are gearing up for the shift to EVs and that kind of thing. So we're often thinking about what is the demand impact of that on oil and other segments of the energy space. But what's your read across on the energy transition into the sort of broad metals mining complex?
So very much, and again, let me answer that question in two parts. The one is on the mining side. So very much, all of the mining companies are converting, first of all, to renewables, and they're doing it mainly on economic terms. So in Chile, the cost of renewables has come down so much that they've actually been able to buy themselves out of their contracts with thermal coal producers or power producers, and switch to renewable energy, and it's been NPV positive for them. So they're certainly shifting for that. They're either trialing or looking to trial either battery-powered diggers and loaders and dump trucks. So that's very much on the cards, or they're looking at fuel cells. So Anglo American, which has a big platinum division, is looking at fuel cells, trying to boost their own demand, and many of the others are looking at a combination of EVs and fuel cells. So certainly on the cards, but I must say it's still quite it's in its infancy. So I would say if it's 5% at this stage in the global mining fleet, that would be quite high. But the adoption, they are certainly looking at that. On the steel side, particularly in Europe, hydrogen is going to be probably the end game for them, where they can get to carbon-free steel. But before they get there, natural gas is probably going to be the transition fuel for them to move away from coal, or metallurgical coal particularly. But again, it's at very early stages, and this is going to take multi-decades before we get there.
Okay, thank you, Grant. I agree that the transition is a multi-decade process. You won't hear too much different here on this call. And just a quick advert, you are about to have a very similar call, but deep dive metals and mining with Andrew Cosgrove and the rest of the global metals and mining team. You can email myself or Grant if you want more information on how to join that. It's they don't do it twice a month, but I think once a month, at least for right now. So lots of great discussion going to unfold there if you want to go deeper on the metals and mining space. So thank you, Grant. And with that, we're going to pivot to our senior oil analyst, Will Hares. Okay, so Will, you just heard Grant break down his view on kind of where the metals and mining space could be in the next few quarters. You've got a note out on oil just this morning. Give us your sense. Are we at a stable price? What's the risk? Is the greater risk to the upside or downside at this stage in your view?
Thanks, Rob. So we're really seeing a strengthening oil demand recovery in the oil markets, and this is really facilitated by vaccine rollouts across the OECD and easing public health restrictions, and really this combining with strict OPEC plus supply constraints, with their recent new policy of adding 400,000 barrels a day every month, is driving oil market tightness, and we think this is going to persist, and even we see potential risk to the upside on prices as demand really is strengthening throughout Asia. And one of the keys here is that oil prices is a major contributor to inflationary pressures, and we are currently at around mid $70 a barrel Brent, and we think this could continue to climb through year end and be another factor in global inflationary pressures. This is really supportive of our thesis, which we've been writing on for the last few months, that inflation signals that we are seeing are not showing to be transitory in the near term, and definitely the oil market as it stands right now is going to be a major factor in that.
Will, stay put. We're going to come back to you, but I want to bring on Patricio Alveraz first. Okay, so you just heard what Will had to say on very constructive outlook for the oil market. When you flip to natural gas, are you seeing a similar story? We're obviously setting records. If you're following the terminal, you're seeing kind of a daily headline on this new record set. So tell us where we're at and give us a sense of where we could be headed.
Sure, Rob. So I think similar to the oil markets, we've seen a recovery for gas demand, but I think the recovery has been a bit more uneven, as we saw stronger post-pandemic industrial demand, especially in China during the first half of the year, drawing a lot of the LNG cargoes that are used by Europe traditionally to fill up storage levels, storage capacity here. Plus a bit of reduced exports from Russia into Europe, and also outages in Norway have left storage levels depleted, and they are below the 10-year norm for storage levels. So we're about 70%, when the average really is closer to 90% entering the winter. So this leaves a gap of about anywhere from 15 to 20% that has to be made up before the end of October. So I think that's the main driver behind natural gas prices at the moment. Looking forward, we expect natural gas prices in Europe and in the UK to remain elevated through the winter, especially because that's when the withdrawal season is, and it's seasonally higher demand. Moving forward, this also sort of I'd say reinforces the longer term fundamentals for natural gas. As Grant also mentioned in the beginning, there is evidence that natural gas may have some staying power, especially as a transition fuel, and it will also, accompany the energy transition longer term.
Fascinating stuff. Obviously, the gas price feeds into the power price, but we're also seeing higher coal prices, higher carbon prices, which are also a factor there. And just today, we seem to have this, and I hate the analogy, perfect storm, but we've got a major electric transmission link between the UK and France that's going to be down approximately a month, it seems, under best case scenario. So tell us a little bit about that, and how are you looking at the power side of the equation? I know you cover some of the utilities as well, and are they prepared for this big run up that we're seeing, and how are they responding from a strategic perspective?
Sure. So I think touching up on the first point about the interconnector, I think it's good to make a little overview of what happened. So there was a fire at Sellinge in Kent. That's the port in the UK. So this has taken the IFA1 interconnector that has about 2,000 megawatt capacity, has taken it temporarily down, at least for 1 month, as you said, that at the earliest. But it's also left the other sort of sister cable interconnector IFA2 untouched. So that means that supplies are reduced, but not completely out. And the other part that's important is that the cable that is out was already running at half capacity due to a planned maintenance, which was set to see it out until September 17th. So in that context, the UK is a net gas importer, but at the same time, imports only account for about 5% of energy supply in the UK, and about half of that comes from France. So the overall sort of impact, if you were to cut all supplies from France, would be about 2.5% on an annualized basis. Looking forward, if the outage does last about a month, we expect this to have limited implications in the energy supply security, let's say, of the UK. But in the meantime, this will definitely bring more support toward upward support for power prices as power generators sort of turn to natural gas to make up for any shortfalls. So that's sort of the overall picture. Again, it's very similar to natural gas. As you mentioned, it also affects carbon pricing. And just because of the power setting mechanism in wholesale power markets, this just, as you said, is a perfect storm of keeping power prices on an upward trajectory, or at least close to where they are for the short term at least. But how utilities are poised to benefit, it seems like the market perhaps has not adjusted expectations for power prices in the winter, because higher power prices tend to be good for generators and utilities, integrated utilities with trading arms, and this hasn't yet, I think, translated into market expectations. And I think the other part that is important to note is that governments in Europe are already taking measures to sort of protect customers. For example, in Spain, the government has announced a plan to cap prices for retail customers, which are usually exposed to spot power prices. And this sort of brings a bit of the ghost of regulatory risk back into Spain. And whilst it's another market in Italy, they have announced that they will make up for the shortfall to try and protect customers using public funds. So I think, yes, utilities will benefit from this, but it's still a bit uncertain to what degree.
Patricio, you mentioned regulatory risk. I think that this is something that we constantly think about in the energy sector because there are all sorts of trade-offs. Just recently here in Norway, we've got the election of a new government. Will, you put out a note recently looking at the Norwegian election, how it could affect E&P policy or upstream policy in the country. Give us a sense of what the new government could do on the upstream side of the equation, and to give us your outlook, please.
Yeah, so Norway held an election on Monday of this week, and the result appears to be a rare change in power from 8 years of center-right governments in the country. And so the Norwegian Labour Party looks set to form a coalition with two other parties, the center and socialist left, which we think will bring minor but meaningful policy adjustments for the oil and gas space. I would note that Norway's Labour Party is generally pro-oil, and so is the Centre Party. But in order to achieve a majority of seats in their parliament, relying on the socialist left in their coalition may force their hand on some of the more policies that target the oil and gas sector. And more generally, we think that this election result is starting to reflect changing attitudes in Norway over climate and sustainability issues, and particularly the role of oil and gas in the country's future, which clearly, as Western Europe's largest oil producer, is a major issue in the country and a major contributor to their economy. So the policy adjustments we think that could materialize relate to exploration. and specifically exploration for oil and gas in new areas. So existing approved areas for development and exploration, we do not think any change will occur. But in new areas, which are the deep water of the Norwegian Sea and the North and Eastern Barents Sea in the Arctic off the northern coast of Norway, which are previously or very highly underexplored areas. We think that the socialist left could make their support of a coalition government conditional upon moving to restrict exploration activity in these areas. And this is really for a few reasons. Number one is that Norway has a significant amount of undeveloped reserves already on their continental shelf, and there is a growing movement to prevent any further exploration of resource, arguing that there is already sufficient or indeed even too much reserves already to develop and produce. And then second is that these areas, specifically the Barents Sea, are much more environmentally sensitive, and should any industrial accidents or spills occur, the environment would suffer really disproportionately for given it's in such a frontier region and so far away from most other oil developments in the country. So that's the situation in Norway. Once again, we don't think any dramatic changes will occur on policy for oil and gas, given it is such a central component of the country. But it is definitely notable that after 8 years of center-right governments, that we are seeing gradual but also meaningful change that is probably going to materialize for the oil and gas space.
Fascinating developments there, Will. Thank you for your comments. We do have another election that's coming up very soon in Germany, and I want to get comments from both of you guys on this. So the German election potentially has big sway over some of the more downstream side of the energy equation. There are many proposals there looking at everything from ICE automobile sales, the role of wind, solar, and other renewables in the country. And so there's a potential change there. We'll start with you first, Patricio. Any read across on the German election, and does it matter for the upcoming climate conference as well that's taking place shortly in Glasgow?
Sure. It definitely has a lot of implications for utilities in Germany, which overall face a positive regulatory outlook in Germany, especially because of the electrification push. So companies like E.ON and RWE are poised to well, they enjoy a positive regulatory environment. The election outcome could sway the part of the fossil fuel phase out that seems to be still pretty significant for other players in the sector, such as Uniper. They could accelerate the phase out of gas, of coal, which are still pretty important in Germany, and have, funnily enough, sort of protected them at this stage during the energy crunch in Europe. I'd see a few changes emerging there, especially if the Green Party comes into power. And yeah, that's sort of the implications that I see coming, and I'll be putting out a note next week on the implication on each part of the utility sectors.
Will, I want to get your response as well. I mean, you had some very interesting commentary on Norway, and Norway has this great contradiction in my mind in that they're this important player in terms of European oil production, but they've also seen a big rise in the market share of electric vehicles in the country. What's your sense? Could Germany be headed in the same direction as Norway in terms of how you think about ICE vehicles, and what would it mean for oil demand in your view?
Yeah, so I think for Germany, one of the maybe not major issues, but one of the election issues is centering around the phase out of internal combustion engines, and I think it's particularly interesting in Germany because this is a country's identity which is wrapped up around automobiles. So I think it's particularly contentious, as I think many Germans see automobiles as a culturally significant industry for them, and so I think this really fits into the overall climate topic, which I think will dominate this election in Germany, just as it has in Norway. It's going to fit with a debate on raising the national carbon pricing, and targets for reaching the 1.5-degree target as well, and even an increasing debate over whether there should be limits for speed on the autobahn, which as most people know, currently does not have any limits, and this is all over emissions concerns. So yes, I personally think that this election will have the climate and sustainability as really key issues, and I think just as the direction of travel is showing from Norway, and just generally seeing from strategies across companies, that targets are typically being brought forward rather than the opposite. So I'm interested to see what happens in this election, and I'll have a couple notes coming out over the next week, detailing some things on climate and climate targets and emissions.
Thank you, Will. I think that brings us to the end of our time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. We hold these calls on the first and third Wednesday of every month. We'd encourage you to attend. If you can't make it and you have a question, reach out to us over IB or email, and stay tuned. All this content, everything that we've been talking about, you can find our research, you can find our notes on these sort of topics by visiting BI Go. And we look forward to being in touch. I hope everyone has a great remainder of their week.